Hey everyone, tonight we're heading to ancient Rome, a place where you could rule half the known world, but still get fined for wearing the wrong colour, crying too loudly at a funeral, or walking around at night looking suspiciously alive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. In ancient Rome, clothing was not about expressing your personality, your mood, or your authentic self. It was about broadcasting one very important message: how much trouble you could legally cause. Fashion was not art. It was a warning system, and the loudest warning of all was purple. Purple dye was so expensive it bordered on parody. It was made by crushing enormous quantities of tiny sea snails, each one contributing a microscopic drop of pigment before dyeing for the cause of imperial drip. Thousands of snails for a single garment. The process smelled awful, took forever, and required trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean. Wearing purple was essentially walking around saying, "I own resources you will never emotionally recover from." Naturally, Rome decided this colour needed rules. Only emperors, senators and top officials were allowed to wear significant amounts of purple. A fully purple toga was the ancient equivalent of wearing a flashing sign that read, "I have authority and you absolutely do not." It saved time. Instead of arguing, debating or asking questions, you simply looked at the toga and thought, "Ah, prison speed-run outfit." To modern people, this sounds dramatic. To Romans, it was practical. Rome was enormous, overcrowded and tense. There were no uniforms, no ID cards, no helpful lanyards. You needed instant visual clarity. Purple did that job beautifully. No confusion. No awkward misunderstandings. No accidentally insulting someone who could legally ruin your entire bloodline. There was also an economic reason. Romans loved status, a little too much. If purple hadn't been restricted, wealthy elites would have started competitive fashion wars, bankrupting themselves just to outflex each other at dinner parties. Rome had already learned that when rich men compete aggressively, republics collapse. Limiting purple was basically the ancient version of saying, "Please stop before this gets stupid." Breaking the rule was serious business. Wearing purple without permission was treated as impersonating authority. Rome did not enjoy that. At all. This wasn't a fashion faux pas. This was identity fraud with sandals. So yes, Rome banned people from wearing a colour. Not because they were petty, but because they understood something deeply Roman. Clear hierarchy prevents arguments. Arguments turn into violence. Violence ruins empires. And if all of that could be avoided by telling most people, "No, you may not wear the fancy snail colour," Rome considered that a bargain. In ancient Rome, grief was allowed. Dramatic grief, however, was treated like an uncontrolled fire hazard. Romans believed mourning needed limits, not because they were emotionally repressed robots, but because they had learned, through painful experience, that public emotion spreads faster than logic and ends badly. Very badly. When one person screamed, 10 joined in. When 10 cried, a crowd gathered. When a crowd gathered, Rome quietly prepared for a riot. So, Rome regulated grief. Professional mourners existed, people paid to wail, cry, tear their hair, and perform sorrow at funerals. And yes, Rome regulated them too. How loudly they could cry, how long they could mourn, and how theatrical they were allowed to be, all had limits. Because nothing destabilizes a city quite like hired grief performers screaming at full volume in the streets. Women, in particular, were forbidden from excessive public mourning. Loud wailing, self-harm gestures, dramatic hair pulling, or collapsing theatrically in public. Not because Rome hated women, but because these displays attracted crowds, and crowds attracted chaos. Rome did not care who started unrest. It cared that unrest started. This wasn't about suppressing emotion. Romans mourned privately, at home, within families. They cried. They remembered. They honoured the dead. They just weren't allowed to turn grief into a public spectacle that could ignite political tension. Funerals were emotional events, and emotional events were dangerous in a city already buzzing with rumours, rivalries and ambitions. There was also a class issue. Wealthy families could afford enormous dramatic funerals, poor families could not. If grief became competitive, louder cries, bigger processions, more dramatic performances, funerals would turn into status contests. Rome had already learned that when elites compete publicly, someone ends up dead, and it's usually the Republic. So mourning was rationed. Think of it as emotional crowd control. Rome knew that feelings are contagious. Anger spreads, fear spreads, grief spreads. And once emotions start spreading, laws stop working. From Rome's perspective, allowing unlimited public mourning was like allowing open flames in a grain warehouse. It wasn't cruel to regulate it, it was preventative. So yes, ancient Rome told people how much they were allowed to grieve, not because they lacked empathy, but because they understood something modern societies still struggle with. Uncontrolled emotion doesn't stay personal for long. It turns political, and political emotion can burn an empire down faster than any enemy army. In ancient Rome, dinner was never just dinner. It was politics, performance and psychological warfare served on a silver platter, sometimes literally. And Rome, being Rome, decided that if people were going to show off at the table, it needed rules. Strict ones. These were called sumptuary laws, and they controlled how much food you could serve, how many guests you could invite, and even which ingredients were acceptable. Not because Romans hated fun, but because they had discovered a dangerous truth. Rich people cannot be trusted to stop flexing on their own. Left unchecked, elite Romans competed through banquets the way modern influencers compete through lifestyle posts. Bigger feasts, rarer foods, more exotic imports, louder displays of, "I am doing better than you." This wasn't harmless indulgence. It ruined families. Senators bankrupted themselves trying to keep up appearances, then tried to recover financially by doing things like bribery, corruption, and lightly destabilizing the state. Rome had already seen this movie, and it didn't like the ending. So the government stepped in and said, "You may host a dinner, but it will be a reasonable dinner." There were limits on meat consumption, luxury items, and extravagance, especially during certain times of year. Yes, Rome literally told people to calm down with the peacock tongues. This wasn't about protecting the poor from envy. It was about protecting the state from elite stupidity. When powerful families started competing socially, alliances fractured, debts mounted, and politics turned toxic. Rome understood that the fastest way to destroy a republic was to let its elites spiral into status addiction. There was also a moral angle, or at least Rome's version of one. Excessive luxury was seen as weakening discipline. Soft men made bad leaders, and nothing screamed soft like needing 7 courses just to feel important. Of course, Romans hated these laws. They complained constantly. They found loopholes. They reclassified foods. They hosted technically legal dinners that were absolutely not in the spirit of the law. Rome passed new regulations. The rich ignored them again. This dance continued for centuries. But the intent was always the same. Stop turning dinner into a political arms race. So yes, Rome limited what you could eat at your own party. Not because it hated pleasure, but because it knew that when wealth competes unchecked, collapse is only a matter of time. And Rome preferred boring dinners to civil war. Of all Roman rules, this one tends to make modern readers quietly put the book down and stare at the wall for a moment. In Roman society, the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held extraordinary legal power over his family. And when I say family, I don't mean just children. I mean adult sons, daughters, grandchildren, slaves, property, finances, and basically the entire domestic universe orbiting him. Yes, even adult sons, married, with children, possibly balding, still legally under dad. This authority included control over finances, marriages, careers, and in the earliest periods, even life and death decisions, which sounds horrifying, and sometimes was. But Rome didn't arrive at this system by accident. It was the result of deep fear. Fear of disorder. Fear of divided authority. Fear of households turning into little civil wars. Rome viewed the family as a miniature state, and every state, according to Roman thinking, needed one ruler. Not a committee, not a group chat. One authority figure whose word ended arguments immediately. Efficiency over feelings. Always. In a world without police constantly present, without social safety nets, without bureaucratic oversight, the household had to regulate itself. The father's power ensured responsibility flowed upward. If something went wrong, debt, crime, scandal, Rome knew exactly who to blame. Accountability mattered more than fairness. And here's the part people often miss. With power came obligation. A paterfamilias was legally responsible for everyone under his roof. Their debts, their crimes, their survival. If your household collapsed, Rome didn't care about excuses. You failed as a leader. This system discouraged rebellion inside the home. It forced unity. It made families stable economic units rather than emotional democracies. Rome wasn't trying to build happy households. It was trying to build predictable ones. Over time, this power softened. Abuse became frowned upon. Social pressure mattered. But the legal structure remained because it worked. Roman households were durable. They produced soldiers, workers, heirs, and taxpayers reliably, which is all the state really wanted. So yes, Roman fathers had terrifying authority, not because Rome loved cruelty, but because Rome feared chaos more. And if choosing between emotional comfort and social stability, Rome chose stability every single time, and then wrote a law about it. Ancient Rome is famous for many achievements: roads, aqueducts, concrete, empire-wide bureaucracy, and yes, public toilets, communal public toilets, with no stalls at all. Imagine a long stone bench with evenly spaced holes, everyone sitting side by side, conducting business, both personal and conversational. This was not a social failure. This was Roman efficiency. And naturally, Rome had rules for it. Public latrines weren't casual hangout spots. They were regulated spaces, because sanitation, in a city of over 1 million people, was a matter of survival. Disease didn't politely knock. It moved in aggressively, and refused to leave. So Rome treated bathroom behaviour as a public health issue, not a private moment. There were expectations. You didn't linger too long. You didn't splash. You didn't cause a scene. Conversation was allowed, but not theatrics. Rome wanted order, not commentary, and absolutely no treating the latrine like a performance venue. One of the most infamous features was the shared cleaning sponge, mounted on a stick and rinsed in salt water between uses. Before you recoil too hard, understand that Romans genuinely believed this was hygienic. Germ theory did not exist. Salt water seemed clean enough. And honestly, after a few months in ancient Rome, your standards adjusted dramatically. Rules existed to prevent chaos. If people fought over seats, lingered excessively, or turned latrines into social clubs, congestion happened. Congestion led to filth. Filth led to disease. Disease led to panic. Panic led to unrest. Rome did not enjoy unrest. There was also a social aspect. Latrines were public, shared spaces that reinforced equality, at least temporarily. Rich and poor sat side by side. Senators and shopkeepers shared the same stone bench. Rome liked this. It reminded citizens that despite hierarchy, everyone participated in the same systems. And yes, even bodily waste was regulated. Human waste was valuable, used in tanning, cleaning clothes, and agriculture. Stealing waste from latrines could actually get you fined. Rome did not waste waste. To modern people, Roman toilets sound horrifying. To Romans, they were marvels of infrastructure. Running water, drainage, organization, rules. Rome didn't care about your comfort. It cared that its citizens didn't die of preventable illness. So yes, ancient Rome told people how to behave in the bathroom. Not because it was intrusive, but because without rules, Even civilization itself starts to smell terrible. In ancient Rome, nighttime was not romantic. It was not mysterious. It was not for leisurely strolls beneath the moon. Nighttime was when bad decisions clocked in for their shift. Once the sun went down, Rome became a very different city. Streets were poorly lit. Buildings were tightly packed. Fires spread easily. Criminals thrived. And political conspiracies loved the dark the way mosquitoes love exposed skin. So Rome did what Rome always did when faced with danger. It assumed you were guilty until daylight proved otherwise. Walking around at night made you suspicious by default. Patrols watched the streets, guards questioned people, and if you were out late without a very good reason, Rome assumed you were either planning something illegal or already halfway through it. This wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. Most fires started at night, when people used lamps and torches indoors. Most thefts happened at night, when shops were closed and streets were empty. Most assassinations, ambushes, and secret meetings happened at night, when witnesses were scarce and shadows were cooperative. Rome responded by discouraging nighttime movement altogether. If you had to be out, you needed a reason. Work, emergency, official business. Wandering aimlessly was not considered a valid excuse. Rome did not believe in just going for a walk to clear my head. Night watchmen carried authority, and resisting them was a very bad idea. Rome preferred to inconvenience innocent people rather than allow criminals freedom. This was a recurring theme. There was also a fire risk. Rome burned frequently, catastrophically frequently. Entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight. Limiting nighttime movement reduced the chances of accidental fires and made it easier to identify who was responsible when one inevitably happened. Even elites weren't immune. Senators moved with escorts. Wealthy citizens stayed indoors. Darkness equalized everyone, and Rome hated uncertainty. To modern people, this feels oppressive. To Romans, it felt logical. The city was too big, too crowded, and too volatile to trust darkness. The night was unpredictable, and unpredictability was Rome's greatest enemy. So yes, Rome treated nighttime walkers with suspicion, not because it hated freedom, but because it understood something deeply uncomfortable. Most disasters don't announce themselves. They happen quietly, after dark. And Rome preferred to be rude than surprised. In ancient Rome, suicide was not automatically illegal. That might surprise you. What was illegal, however, was deciding to die without first filling out the appropriate paperwork. Rome was many things, but spontaneous self-destruction was not one of them. If a Roman citizen wished to end their life, they were expected to submit a formal request to the authorities explaining why. Illness, irreversible disgrace, terminal suffering, loss of honor. These were considered acceptable reasons. I had a bad week was not. To modern ears, this sounds cruel. But to Rome, it was administrative common sense. Every Roman citizen existed inside a web of obligations. Families depended on them, debts were tied to them, inheritances flowed through them, political alliances relied on them. If someone died suddenly, especially by their own hand, the consequences rippled outward. Legal chaos, disputed estates, angry creditors, confused heirs, and occasionally violence. Rome hated chaos more than death. By forcing people to explain themselves, the state filtered impulsive decisions from irreversible ones. Many petitions were denied, not because Rome wanted people to suffer, but because Rome understood something timeless. Humans make terrible choices when overwhelmed. Requiring approval added delay. Delay added reflection. Reflection saved lives. There was also a legal incentive. If someone committed suicide without approval, their property could be confiscated by the state. Families lost inheritance. Debts remained unpaid. Rome made it very clear, dying irresponsibly was financially rude. On the other hand, approved suicides were handled with dignity. Property was protected. Families were spared legal punishment. Society acknowledged the decision as tragic but orderly. Rome preferred sadness with paperwork over chaos without it. And yes, there was a darker motivation. Rome relied on citizens, soldiers, taxpayers, administrators. Letting people remove themselves freely weakened the system. A state that allowed unrestricted self-destruction was, in Rome's eyes, a state slowly bleeding itself out. So suicide was tolerated, but only when it fit Rome's definition of reason. To us it feels invasive. To Rome it was preventative maintenance. Rome did not ask, "Are you suffering?" It asked, "Will this destabilize everything?" And if the answer was yes, the answer to you was no. In ancient Rome, what women wore was not considered a personal choice. It was considered a public statement, one that the state felt extremely qualified to manage. Roman law placed strict limits on women's clothing, jewelry, and visible wealth. How much gold you could wear, how elaborate your garments could be, how much sparkle was considered acceptable before society started asking uncomfortable questions. And yes, Rome absolutely counted. To modern ears, this sounds like moral panic. To Rome, it was damage control. Roman elites had a problem: status competition. And women's fashion became one of the fastest ways to escalate it. Expensive jewelry, imported fabrics, and extravagant styling turned social gatherings into silent wealth battles. One necklace invited a larger necklace. One gown demanded a more outrageous gown. Rome watched this happen and thought, this is how republics die. So the state intervened. By restricting visible luxury, Rome tried to slow the arms race. These laws weren't about modesty in a modern sense. They were about preventing elite families from bankrupting themselves trying to look superior at dinner parties. Rome had already seen enough politicians ruin their finances and then mysteriously recover through corruption. There was also a social clarity issue. Rome relied heavily on visual hierarchy. Clothing signaled marital status, social rank, and moral expectations. A married woman dressed modestly was seen as stable and respectable. Excessive display suggested independence, and independence made Rome nervous. Rome didn't fear women, it feared unpredictability. Jewelry limits also protected families economically. Gold worn in public was literally walking wealth. Theft, envy, and resentment followed. Rome preferred that wealth stay discreet, locked away, accounted for, and taxable. Naturally, Roman women hated these laws. They bent them. They layered jewelry creatively. They found loopholes. They borrowed. They exaggerated hairstyles instead. Roman men complained loudly, then quietly admired the results. Lawmakers passed new restrictions. Everyone ignored them again. This cycle continued for centuries. But the intent never changed. Rome wasn't trying to erase women from public life. It was trying to keep status competition from turning social life into a financial bloodsport. To Rome, regulating women's appearance was regulating social pressure itself. And in a society obsessed with order, pressure was something you controlled. Or it controlled you. So yes, Rome told women what they were allowed to wear. Not because it hated beauty, but because it feared what unchecked beauty did to politics. To modern audiences, gladiators look like ancient superstars. Crowds cheered their names. Graffiti praised them. People collected souvenirs with their images. Some even inspired obsessive fandom that would feel familiar to anyone who has ever seen a comment section lose its mind. But in ancient Rome, the law took one long look at gladiators and said, absolutely not. Despite their fame, gladiators were legally classified as infames, dishonourable persons. This meant they lost many basic rights. They could not vote. They could not hold office. Their testimony in court was limited. Legally speaking, they were closer to criminals than celebrities. Which seems confusing until you remember that Rome hated mixed signals. Gladiators were violent by profession. They killed or were killed for entertainment. Rome understood the danger of glorifying that too much. If people started seeing gladiators as heroes rather than performers, you risked normalizing violence outside the arena. And Rome preferred its violence organized, scheduled, and ticketed. The dishonor status served as a psychological firewall. Yes, you could admire their skill. Yes, you could cheer. But no, you could not aspire to be them in any socially respectable way. Rome wanted admiration without imitation. There was also a class concern. Gladiators often came from enslaved people, prisoners, or the poor. If successful fighters gained full honor, social mobility would accelerate in unpredictable ways. Rome was many things, but flexible about hierarchy was not one of them. Even free men who volunteered to become gladiators were legally degraded. By stepping into the arena, they agreed to lose status. Rome made sure this choice came with consequences. You could gain money, fame, and attention, but you would lose dignity in the eyes of the law. No refunds. This prevented a flood of ambitious young men from abandoning military or civic careers to chase arena glory. Rome needed soldiers and administrators more than it needed influencers with swords. And yet, the contradiction remained. Romans loved gladiators. They fantasized about them. They gossiped about them. They scraped sweat from their bodies to use as cosmetics. Yes, really. Rome simply refused to let that admiration translate into power. So gladiators lived in a strange limbo, adored by the crowd, dismissed by the law, famous but untouchable, celebrated but contained. Rome understood something deeply uncomfortable. If you reward spectacle with status, spectacle eventually replaces governance. And Rome was not about to let a man with a helmet and a trident run the state. In ancient Rome, religion was not a private matter of personal belief. It was a public safety system. And if you failed to uphold your end of the deal with the gods, Rome treated it less like a spiritual mistake and more like negligent endangerment. Romans believed their relationship with the gods was transactional. You perform the ritual correctly, the gods maintain order. You mess it up, the gods get annoyed, and suddenly the city is on fire. Crops are failing, and everyone is asking who angered Jupiter this week. So Rome enforced religious contracts. Public officials were required to perform sacrifices, prayers, and rituals with obsessive precision. Wrong words, wrong timing, wrong animal, wrong hand gesture. Any of it could invalidate the ritual. And if a ritual was invalid, it had to be repeated immediately. Because half-pleasing a god was considered worse than not trying at all. Private citizens weren't off the hook either. Vows made to the gods were legally binding. If you promised a deity something and failed to deliver, you could be fined, shamed, or punished. This wasn't superstition from Rome's perspective. It was risk management. Rome had no meteorologists, no epidemiology, no disaster forecasting. When something went wrong, divine displeasure was the most logical explanation available. And when the explanation is divine anger, enforcement becomes urgent. This system also served a political function. Religion unified the population around shared rituals. It created predictability. Everyone knew when festivals occurred. Everyone knew what sacrifices meant. Everyone knew that if things went badly, someone had failed to follow protocol, and that someone would be investigated. Importantly, Rome didn't care what you believed in your heart. Belief was optional. Participation was mandatory. You could privately doubt the gods all you wanted, as long as you publicly performed the rituals correctly. Rome valued behavior over belief, a very Roman approach. Breaking religious contracts threatened collective confidence. If people believed the gods were displeased, panic followed. Panic led to unrest. Unrest led to instability. Rome did not enjoy instability. So yes, Rome punished people for upsetting invisible beings, not because Rome was irrational, but because Rome understood that shared belief systems, however strange, hold societies together. To Rome, keeping the gods happy was not theology, it was infrastructure. In ancient Rome, words were not harmless. They were dangerous tools, sharp, contagious, and fully capable of burning the city down without ever lighting a fire. Rome understood something modern societies often relearn the hard way. One convincing speaker in the wrong place at the wrong time can do more damage than an army. So Rome watched public speech very closely. You could not simply stand in a public space and start addressing a crowd. That wasn't free expression. That was suspicious behavior. Unauthorized speeches were treated as potential threats, especially if they involved criticism of officials, emotional language, or, worst of all, promises to fix everything. Rome had seen this before. Charismatic speakers stirred resentment. Resentment gathered crowds. Crowds demanded action. Action turned into riots, assassinations, or civil war. Rome preferred boredom to bloodshed. Only certain people were allowed to speak publicly in official contexts: magistrates, senators, priests, or those explicitly permitted. Even then, there were expectations about tone. Calm, measured, controlled. Shouting was frowned upon. Emotional appeals were risky. If your speech made people feel too much, Rome started paying attention. This control extended into politics. Electioneering had limits. Personal attacks were regulated. Gathering large groups required approval. Rome wasn't trying to silence debate. It was trying to keep debate from mutating into mob behavior. And Rome absolutely distrusted spontaneous crowds. If people suddenly gathered around a speaker, authorities assumed something was wrong. No one thought, an inspiring talk. They thought, who is manipulating whom? There was also a class dimension. The elite were trained in rhetoric. The masses were not. Allowing unrestricted public speaking risked giving influence to people who were persuasive but not invested in maintaining order. Rome didn't mind ideas. It minded unpredictable influence. This is why Roman leaders often spoke from elevated platforms, in designated spaces, at approved times. Structure mattered. Control mattered. The city was already loud enough. So yes, Rome regulated who could speak, where, and how. Not because it hated speech, but because it feared what speech could become once emotions took over. Rome trusted law, it distrusted crowds, and it never forgot that revolutions often begin with someone saying, "Hear me out." In ancient Rome, adultery was not treated as a private relationship issue. It was treated as a public threat. Rome did not ask, "Are you happy?" Rome asked, "Will this cause legal chaos in 3 generations?" Under Roman law, adultery was a crime. Not because Romans were moral Puritans, but because they were obsessed with lineage, inheritance, and social clarity. Who fathered which child mattered enormously. Property, citizenship, family alliances, and political futures all depended on knowing exactly whose bloodline continued where. Adultery introduced uncertainty, and Rome hated uncertainty. If a married woman had an affair, the question wasn't romance. The question was legitimacy. Whose child is this? Who inherits the estate? Which family gains power? Which family loses it? One affair could unravel generations of legal planning. Rome preferred to shut that down immediately. Men, of course, were treated differently, because Rome. Affairs with enslaved people or prostitutes were generally tolerated, since they did not threaten inheritance lines. Hypocritical? Absolutely. Consistent with Roman priorities? Completely. Adultery involving a married woman, however, triggered legal consequences. Husbands were expected to act. Fathers had rights to intervene. Courts got involved. This wasn't about heartbreak. It was about restoring order before gossip turned into lawsuits, and lawsuits turned into violence. There was also a political angle. Elite marriages were strategic alliances. Affairs threatened those alliances. If one family felt dishonoured, retaliation followed. Rome had enough civil wars already. It didn't need domestic scandals escalating into political bloodshed. Public enforcement also served as deterrence. By making adultery visible and punishable, Rome discouraged risky behaviour that could destabilise households. The message was simple. Romance is your business, but lineage is Rome's business. And yes, Romans gossiped endlessly about adulterers. Public trials were spectacles. Reputation mattered. Shame was a tool. Rome used it liberally. To modern people, this feels invasive. To Romans, it was preventative law. Rome didn't criminalize desire, it criminalized uncertainty. Because in a society built on inheritance, names and family power, not knowing who belonged where was far more dangerous than hurt feelings. And Rome, as always, chose stability over sympathy. In ancient Rome, death was inevitable, but turning it into a competitive sport was strongly discouraged. Romans took funerals seriously. Very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that they decided to regulate them. Because left unchecked, funerals had a bad habit of spiraling into loud, expensive, emotionally charged performances that solved absolutely nothing and destabilized everything. Funerals were public events. Processions moved through the streets. Mourners gathered. Speeches were made. Emotions ran high. And Rome had learned, through repeated unpleasant experiences, that whenever money, grief, and crowds mix, things get messy fast. Wealthy families, especially, had a tendency to turn funerals into status displays. More mourners, more musicians, more professional wailers, more expensive coffins, more everything. The dead were no longer being honoured. They were being used as props in a social competition between families who really needed to calm down. So Rome stepped in. Funeral laws limited how much money could be spent, how many mourners could attend, how elaborate the procession could be, and even how much gold could be buried with the deceased. This wasn't about disrespecting the dead. It was about stopping grief from becoming political theatre. There was also an economic concern. Lavish funerals bankrupted families. Debts followed. Debts led to resentment. Resentment led to lawsuits, feuds, and occasionally people showing up with knives. Rome preferred that mourning end with tears, not litigation. Public emotion was another issue. Large funerals attracted crowds. Crowds became agitated. Agitated crowds started listening to speeches. Speeches turned emotional. Emotional speeches turned political. And suddenly, Rome had a protest disguised as a funeral. Rome had seen this before. It did not enjoy it. Limiting funeral extravagance kept death private, controlled, and predictable. It ensured that grief remained a family matter, not a citywide event that could trigger unrest. Of course, Romans complained endlessly. The wealthy hated being told how to spend their money. Families bent the rules. They exaggerated quietly. They held modest funerals that were absolutely not modest. Rome passed new regulations. Everyone pretended to listen, but the intent never changed. Rome didn't fear death. It feared what people did with death when given a stage. And in a city already overflowing with drama, Rome decided that mourning did not need a spotlight. In ancient Rome, freedom was real, but it came with terms and conditions. Very Roman terms and conditions. When a slave was freed, they did not simply walk off into the sunset as a fully independent citizen with no strings attached. Instead, they became a freedman or freedwoman, legally free but still bound by obligations to their former master, now politely renamed their patron. Same relationship, better branding. To modern ears, this sounds suspiciously like freedom with homework. To Rome, it was a brilliant compromise. Rome relied heavily on slavery. Freeing large numbers of enslaved people too quickly, with no structure, risked social chaos. Suddenly, you would have thousands of new citizens with no resources, no support networks, and no loyalty to existing power structures. Rome did not enjoy surprises. So the patron-client system stepped in. Freed people owed their former masters loyalty, respect, and often services. They might be expected to work for them, support them politically, or assist them economically. In return, patrons provided protection, legal help, and social access. It was dependence, yes, but it was stable dependence. Rome preferred gradual change over sudden disruption, always. This system also protected freed people. Without patrons, newly freed individuals would have been vulnerable to exploitation, poverty, and violence. Rome did not offer social safety nets. Your safety net was relationships. Patronage gave freed people a place in society, even if it wasn't perfect. There was also a political reason. Patrons gained loyal supporters. Freedmen voted, campaigned, and reinforced their patrons' influence. This helped elites maintain power while still allowing limited social mobility. Rome loved systems where everyone felt they gained something, even if the gains were uneven. And yes, some freedmen became incredibly successful, wealthy, influential, respected. But even then, public reminders of their status remained. Their gratitude was expected. Their loyalty was monitored. Freedom did not erase history. To modern sensibilities, this feels restrictive. To Rome, it felt safe. Rome did not want revolutions. It wanted controlled transitions. So freedom came with obligations. Not because Rome hated liberty, but because it understood that liberty without structure tends to explode. And Rome preferred slow change with paperwork over sudden change with riots. If there is one idea that truly defines ancient Rome, it's this. Nothing was ever just private. Not your clothes, not your family, not your love life, not even the promises you made to invisible gods. Rome believed that personal behavior didn't stay personal for very long. It leaked, spread, and eventually showed up as a public problem. So Rome intervened early. To a Roman, the state was not something that existed out there. It was everywhere. In the household, in the family, in rituals, in daily habits. The logic was simple and relentless. If enough individuals made bad choices, society collapsed, and Rome had seen collapse up close enough times to become deeply allergic to it. This is why Rome regulated morality, behavior, and routine. Not because it wanted to micromanage joy, but because it saw patterns. Private excess led to public debt. Private scandals led to feuds. Feuds led to violence. Violence led to instability. Instability led to civil war. Civil war led to new laws written by whoever survived. Rome preferred to skip that part. From the Roman perspective, telling people how to behave wasn't tyranny. It was maintenance. The state didn't trust individuals to always act in the collective interest, especially when emotions, pride, or desire got involved. So it added rules. Many rules. Probably too many rules. But rules that worked. And here's the uncomfortable truth. For centuries, it did work. Rome managed enormous populations, diverse cultures, and constant pressure without modern technology. It held itself together through systems, discipline, and relentless regulation. People didn't have freedom the way we understand it today, but they had predictability, and predictability kept the machine running. Of course, Rome eventually fell. Rules alone don't save empires forever, but they delayed collapse far longer than chaos ever could have. So when we look back at Roman laws and think, that's insane, we're often missing the context. Rome wasn't trying to be humane. It was trying to survive. And survival, as Rome understood it, required limits. On emotion, on behavior, on ambition, and sometimes on joy. Rome didn't ask, is this fair? It asked, will this keep everything from falling apart? And for a long time, the answer was yes. That's why Rome's weirdest rules weren't mistakes. They were warnings. Vincent van Gogh entered the world in 1853 in the small Dutch village of Zundert, a place so quiet it almost seemed designed to magnify inner noise. He was born exactly 1 year after a stillborn brother, also named Vincent, a fact that would quietly haunt his sense of identity for the rest of his life. From an early age, he grew up with the unsettling awareness that he was, in a way, a replacement. Each Sunday, walking past a gravestone bearing his own name, he was reminded that existence could be fragile, accidental, and painfully symbolic. His father was a Protestant pastor, strict but sincere, while his mother was artistic, fond of drawing flowers and arranging nature with careful hands. From her, Vincent absorbed a sensitivity to colour and form. From his father, a moral seriousness that would later turn into obsession. He was not a cheerful child. Teachers described him as intense, awkward, and distant. Other children played. Vincent stared. He watched people the way others watched weather, silently, trying to understand patterns. School never suited him. He drifted from place to place, unable to settle, increasingly isolated. Social rules felt artificial to him, like poorly written instructions everyone else pretended to understand. He wanted meaning, purpose, something absolute. When he spoke, he often spoke too much. When he felt too deeply. This combination did not make him popular. In his late teens, Vincent began working for an art dealership, Goupil and Company. Ironically, he sold paintings long before he ever painted one. At first, he was competent, even promising. But once again, intensity ruined balance. He grew contemptuous of art buyers, disgusted by commerce, convinced that art should be sacred rather than traded like furniture. He preached to customers. Management was not impressed. Throughout these years, letters to his brother Theo reveal a man already at war with himself. Vincent longed to be useful, to matter, to serve something higher, God, humanity, truth. He tried religion. He tried teaching. He tried preaching to minors, giving away his clothes and sleeping on the floor like a martyr in training. Each attempt ended the same way: rejection, failure, silence. By his late 20s, Vincent was broke, unemployed, and emotionally exhausted. Yet beneath the failures, something restless was sharpening. He had not yet picked up a brush with conviction, but the hunger was there, a need to translate inner storms into something visible. The quiet village that once confined him had unknowingly produced a man who would later make the entire world feel his unease. By the time Vincent van Gogh reached his late 20s, failure had become a familiar companion. He had tried religion, education, and moral devotion, and each path had quietly shut its door in his face. It was only after exhausting nearly every other identity that he turned, almost reluctantly, toward art. Painting was not a childhood dream fulfilled. It was a last refuge, a place where his intensity might finally have a purpose instead of being a liability. At first, Vincent did not aim to be great. He aimed to be honest. He began by drawing peasants, labourers, worn faces, and bent backs. These were people he understood, not socially, but spiritually. He studied anatomy obsessively, filling notebooks with hands, boots, spines, and skulls. His early work was dark, heavy, almost muddy, as if light itself had to struggle to exist on the canvas. Beauty, for Vincent, was not decorative. It was earned through endurance. During this period, his brother Theo became more than family. He became lifeline, patron, and emotional anchor. Theo sent money regularly, not out of obligation, but belief. In return, Vincent sent letters, hundreds of them, raw, philosophical, and painfully sincere. These letters reveal a man constantly questioning his worth, his sanity, and whether suffering itself might be the price of seeing the world clearly. Vincent studied art formally in fits and starts, never quite fitting into academic systems. He admired artists who painted ordinary life with dignity rather than fantasy. He rejected polish. He wanted truth, even if it was ugly. This mindset made his progress slow and his frustration immense. He destroyed works, restarted endlessly, and criticized himself with a cruelty no teacher could match. Loneliness intensified everything. Vincent wanted connection desperately, yet pushed people away with the same force. He fell in love recklessly, often with women who did not return his feelings. Each rejection deepened his belief that he was fundamentally misaligned with the world. Still, he painted. Not because it made him happy, but because not painting felt worse. What began to emerge during these years was not mastery, but vision. Vincent was learning how to see, not surfaces, but emotional weight. Fields were no longer landscapes. Faces were no longer faces. Everything became charged with inner meaning. Art was no longer a profession. It was survival. The real transformation in Vincent's art began when he left the grey skies of the north and moved south to Paris. The city was loud, crowded, and overwhelming, but it exposed him to something that would permanently alter his vision: colour as emotion. Here he encountered impressionists and modern painters who treated light not as an accessory, but as a subject. For Vincent, this was not a stylistic lesson. It was a revelation. Until then, his palette had been dark and earthy, shaped by coal mines, poverty, and moral gravity. In Paris, colour arrived like a shock to the nervous system. Yellows burned, blues vibrated, greens refused to sit quietly. Vincent absorbed everything with manic intensity, studying brushwork, composition and theory, while simultaneously rejecting imitation. He was not interested in blending in. He wanted colour to speak, to shout, to bleed, feeling directly onto the canvas. This period was productive but unstable. Vincent painted constantly, sometimes finishing multiple works in a single week. His brushstrokes grew faster, thicker, more urgent. He stopped smoothing edges and began attacking the surface, as if painting were a physical confrontation. The canvas was no longer a window. It was a battlefield. Living with other artists proved difficult. Vincent admired them deeply, yet clashed constantly. His conversations were intense, exhausting, often spiraling into obsession. He drank heavily, barely ate, and worked until collapse. Friends came and went. Vincent remained, restless and burning. Still, something extraordinary was happening. He began to believe that colour itself could replace realism, that a field did not need to look like a field if it felt like one. A night sky did not need accuracy if it could convey awe, dread, or longing. This belief separated him from tradition and pushed him toward isolation, but it also unlocked the voice that would define him. His letters during this time oscillate between hope and despair. One day, he is convinced he is close to something important. The next, he is certain he is wasting his life. Success remains distant, recognition non-existent, yet his inner compass has shifted. Vincent is no longer searching for purpose. He has found it, even if it is destroying him. By the end of this chapter of his life, Vincent's art is no longer tentative. It is unmistakably his. The storm inside him has found colour, movement, and rhythm. What remains uncertain is whether the human mind behind it can survive the intensity of its own creation. Seeking light, warmth, and clarity, Vincent left Paris and travelled south to Arles, a quiet town bathed in sun and sharp colours. Here, he believed, he could finally build something lasting, not just paintings, but a life. He rented a small house with yellow walls, modest and plain, yet filled with possibility. To Vincent, it was more than shelter. It was a vision. He imagined it as a home for artists, a shared space where creativity could thrive without rivalry or loneliness. The sunlight of Arles transformed his work almost immediately. Colours intensified, yellows became blazing, blues deepened, and ordinary subjects, chairs, sunflowers, bedrooms, gained a strange emotional gravity. Vincent painted obsessively, often working outdoors for hours under the sun, ignoring exhaustion and hunger. The rhythm was punishing, but the results were electric. For the first time, he felt close to harmony. But the dream required people, and Vincent struggled with people. When Paul Gauguin arrived to join him, hope surged. Vincent admired Gauguin deeply and believed their partnership could define a new era of art. At first, they worked together, talked endlessly, and challenged one another. Yet beneath the collaboration, tension brewed. Their personalities clashed. Gauguin was controlled and distant, Vincent volatile and emotionally exposed. Conversations turned sharp. Criticism felt like betrayal. Vincent's mental state began to fracture under the pressure. He feared abandonment constantly, terrified that Gauguin would leave and the dream would collapse. Sleeplessness, paranoia, and emotional instability intensified. The house that was meant to symbolize unity became a space charged with anxiety. The breaking point came suddenly and violently. After a heated confrontation, Vincent suffered a psychological crisis. In a moment of profound distress, he mutilated his own ear, an act that has since overshadowed much of his work, though it was not madness in isolation, but the result of prolonged strain, isolation, and inner torment. Gauguin left. The dream ended. Vincent was hospitalized, confused, ashamed, and devastated. The yellow house stood nearly empty, its walls still bright, but stripped of hope. Yet even in collapse, Vincent painted. From hospital rooms and moments of clarity, he continued to work, translating suffering into form. Arles gave him his most vivid colours and his deepest wounds. The dream of belonging had failed, but it revealed something brutal and undeniable. Vincent could not escape himself. All he could do was paint what lived inside. After the collapse in Arles, Vincent voluntarily entered the asylum at Saint-Remy, a former monastery surrounded by olive groves and stone corridors that echoed with quiet suffering. It was a place meant to contain chaos, not cure it. Yet for Vincent, confinement brought a strange, fragile order. The world narrowed, distractions fell away. What remained was the constant battle inside his mind, and a window through which he could still see the sky. Life in the asylum moved slowly, punctuated by episodes of severe mental distress. There were days when Vincent could not speak clearly, could not work, could not trust his own thoughts. During these periods, he was overwhelmed by hallucinations, confusion, and fear. He described feeling trapped inside his own head, watching himself unravel. But between these storms came intervals of calm, and during those moments, he painted with extraordinary focus. The asylum garden became one of his primary subjects. Irises, olive trees, cypresses, nature rendered not as background, but as emotional force. His brushstrokes grew more rhythmic, almost musical, swirling and pulsing with contained intensity. These were not peaceful paintings. They were controlled explosions, order imposed on inner chaos. From his small room, Vincent painted the view outside his barred window. The sky fascinated him, vast, unreachable, alive. It was during this time that he created some of his most iconic works, including the night sky that seems to move, breathe, and twist under unseen pressure. These paintings were not fantasies. They were perceptions filtered through a mind perpetually on edge. Despite his productivity, Vincent remained deeply uncertain about his worth. He sold almost nothing. Recognition did not come. Letters to Theo reveal gratitude mixed with guilt. Gratitude for support, guilt for being a burden. He worried constantly that his illness made him useless, that his art was compensation rather than contribution. Yet something remarkable occurred within those walls. Vincent began to understand that painting did not require happiness. It required honesty. The asylum stripped away illusions of normal life, leaving him with nothing but sensation, memory, and feeling. And that was enough. Saint-Remy did not heal Vincent, but it gave him structure long enough to create work that feels timeless, precisely because it was born from instability. He was not painting despite his suffering. He was painting through it, moment by moment, storm by storm. After a year inside the asylum, Vincent was released into the care of a physician near Paris, settling in the quiet village of Auvers-sur-Oise. On the surface, this move signalled recovery. He was closer to Theo, under medical supervision, and surrounded by open countryside that invited long walks and steady work. For the first time in years, there was cautious optimism, not happiness, but the possibility of balance. Vincent painted relentlessly. Fields of wheat, village streets, gardens and portraits poured from him at astonishing speed. Sometimes he completed a canvas in a single sitting, driven by an urgency that felt both productive and ominous. His style reached full maturity here. Bold colours, vibrating lines, compositions that seemed to pulse with nervous energy. The landscapes were expansive, yet unsettled. The sky often pressed down. The fields felt restless, never still. Though his output was immense, his inner state remained fragile. Vincent was acutely aware that his stability depended on others, especially Theo. When Theo began to struggle financially and emotionally, Vincent felt the ground shift beneath him. He worried he was a burden, an obligation that never ended. Success still refused to arrive in any meaningful way. A few critics took notice, but recognition was distant and abstract. It did not translate into security. His letters from this period reveal a man caught between hope and dread. One moment, he speaks of future plans, new techniques, a belief that his work may finally matter. The next, he expresses fear that his illness will return without warning, that his mind will betray him again. The calm he experienced felt temporary, borrowed, and fragile. Vincent also felt profoundly alone. While surrounded by nature and people, he remained emotionally isolated, unable to fully connect or rest. The very intensity that fueled his art made ordinary life exhausting. He could paint endlessly, but living quietly seemed impossible. The countryside of Auvers reflected this tension. It was beautiful, open, and alive, yet charged with unease. Vincent did not paint peaceful fields. He painted fields under pressure, skies in motion, paths that seemed to lead nowhere. These were not scenes of rest. They were confessions. This final period was not a descent into sudden darkness, but a slow narrowing of hope. Vincent continued to work because work was the only thing holding him together. Beneath the productivity, however, the shadows remained. Patient, waiting, and growing heavier with each passing day. As the summer in Auvers deepened, Vincent's days followed a quiet, almost ritualistic rhythm. He walked into the fields each morning with his easel and paints, returning hours later exhausted, sunburned, and silent. To an outside observer he appeared disciplined, even calm. But silence, for Vincent, was never empty. It was heavy. It pressed inward. Painting remained his anchor, yet it no longer offered relief, only postponement. Each finished canvas brought a brief sense of order, followed almost immediately by the familiar question, and then what? He produced work at a pace that felt less like inspiration and more like necessity, as if stopping would allow something worse to surface. His relationship with Theo weighed heavily on him. Theo's health was declining, his job uncertain, his family growing. Vincent sensed, perhaps accurately, perhaps not, that the support he relied on could not last forever. This fear cut deeply. The idea that his existence might cause suffering to the one person who believed in him was unbearable. He wrote with increasing anxiety, apologizing for being alive, for costing money, for needing care. Despite moments of external recognition, Vincent felt no internal confirmation. Praise arrived too late and too softly. He did not see himself as a misunderstood genius. He saw himself as unfinished, unstable, and unresolved. The world seemed unwilling to meet him halfway, and he lacked the strength to keep reaching. His paintings from this time grow darker in mood without losing intensity. The colours remain bold, but harmony dissolves. Crows cut across skies, paths split and vanish, horizons tilt slightly, never offering rest. These works feel suspended between movement and collapse, as if the land itself shares his unease. Vincent spoke little about the future. Plans dissolved into vague possibilities. What remained was exhaustion, mental, emotional, and physical. Years of inner struggle had left him worn down, not dramatically, but quietly. There was no single breaking moment, only accumulation. The countryside that once promised calm now felt indifferent. Wide open spaces emphasized isolation rather than freedom. Vincent had always lived intensely, and intensity demands energy. By this stage, the energy was nearly gone. This chapter of his life is defined not by chaos but by heaviness. A man still working, still seeing, still creating, yet carrying a silence that had grown too dense to escape. In late July of 1890, Vincent's life narrowed to its final, fragile shape. The days were warm, the wheat fields tall and restless under the wind. Outwardly, nothing dramatic announced the end. There was no public breakdown, no final manifesto. Vincent continued his routine, walking, painting, returning to his room. Yet something inside him had quietly reached its limit. On one afternoon, Vincent walked into the fields alone. He carried with him the same tools he always did, but this time, painting was no longer enough. What happened next was not impulsive madness, but a tired decision made by a man who had spent years negotiating with pain. He shot himself in the chest. The wound was not immediately fatal. Remarkably, Vincent managed to walk back to his lodging. He collapsed onto his bed, bleeding, conscious, and calm. When questioned, he reportedly said little. There was no anger, no dramatic explanation, only acceptance. Theo was summoned at once. Theo arrived to find his brother weakened but lucid. Over the next 2 days they spoke quietly. Vincent did not express regret. Instead, he spoke with clarity, even relief. He told Theo that the sadness would never end, words that were not theatrical, but resigned. After years of trying to live with intensity in a world that demanded moderation, he was exhausted. Theo stayed by his side as Vincent faded. On the morning of July 29th, Vincent van Gogh died at the age of 37. His final moments were not violent. They were subdued, intimate, and devastatingly human. The aftermath was small. A modest funeral, a handful of mourners. His coffin was covered with sunflowers, flowers he had painted with such devotion. His paintings, now considered priceless, were stacked casually against walls. To the world, his death passed almost unnoticed. For Theo, it was unbearable. He lost not only a brother, but a purpose. Within months, Theo's health collapsed, and he died soon after, never witnessing the recognition that would come. Vincent's final act was not a statement against life, but an admission of limits. He had given everything he had, his mind, his body, his peace, to make inner truth visible. When nothing remained to give, he stopped. The fields remained. The paintings remained. Vincent did not. When Vincent van Gogh died, the world barely noticed. He left behind no wealth, no reputation, no sense of victory. His paintings were unsold, his name obscure, his life widely viewed as a failure wrapped in tragedy. Yet death, which silenced him, also freed his work from the weight of explanation. What remained on the canvases could finally speak without interruption. It was Theo's widow, Johanna, who quietly began the work Vincent himself never could. She preserved his letters, organized his paintings, and believed, fiercely, that the world had simply arrived too early for him. Exhibitions followed. Critics began to look again, then closer. What they found was not madness, but intention. Not chaos, but emotional precision. Vincent's art did not offer comfort. It offered recognition. Viewers saw themselves in the turbulence of his skies, the isolation of his figures, the urgency of his brushstrokes. He painted not how things looked, but how they felt. And feeling, unlike fashion, does not expire. Over time, Van Gogh came to symbolize something larger than painting. He became a mirror for the misunderstood, the sensitive, the relentless. His life story was simplified into myth, the tortured genius, the ear, the madness, but his work resisted reduction. The paintings remained disciplined, deliberate, and deeply controlled. Suffering did not create them. Commitment did. Ironically, the recognition Vincent longed for arrived in excess. His works became some of the most valuable and revered in history. Museums filled, books multiplied. His letters were studied like philosophy. Yet this posthumous success carries a quiet cruelty. The validation came when it no longer mattered to him. What endures is not the tragedy, but the honesty. Vincent never painted to impress. He painted to survive. He gave visual form to emotions most people struggle to name: longing, despair, hope, and the unbearable intensity of being alive. That is why his work still feels immediate. still feels close. Vincent van Gogh did not find peace in life, but he left behind a language for those still searching for it. His legacy is not that suffering produces greatness, but that truth, when pursued without compromise, leaves a mark that outlives the one who made it. The man vanished quietly. The voice remained, louder with each passing generation. Before jazz had a name, before it had rules, before it was written down or argued over, New Orleans was already making it inevitable. This was not a city that waited politely for culture to arrive. It absorbed it, mixed it, and reshaped it in the heat. Sound was everywhere, not as entertainment, but as atmosphere. Music was as common as humidity. New Orleans was unlike any other American city at the turn of the 20th century. French, Spanish, African, Caribbean and American influences overlapped without fully dissolving into one another. Languages blended, religions overlapped, traditions collided daily. The result was not harmony in the classical sense, but friction. And friction produces heat. Heat produces movement. Music in the city did not belong to concert halls. It lived in the streets. Brass bands marched through neighborhoods for weddings, funerals, and parades, sometimes all in the same week. Churches rang with hymns shaped by African call and response. Docks echoed with work songs. Dance halls pulsed with rhythm late into the night. There was no clear boundary between sacred and secular. Everything fed everything else. One of the most important spaces was Congo Square, where enslaved and formerly enslaved black people gathered on Sundays to dance, drum, and preserve rhythmic traditions that were not supposed to survive. These gatherings were not performances. They were memory made audible. Rhythm passed from body to body, generation to generation, even when language and homeland were stripped away. At the same time, European musical traditions brought structure, harmony, notation, instruments, and formal training. Marching bands played precise arrangements. Opera houses staged grand works. Conservatory-trained musicians lived just blocks away from self-taught players who learned by ear. In New Orleans, these worlds did not stay separate. They listened to each other. Crucially, the city did not demand purity. You could borrow, bend, distort, and recombine. Mistakes were tolerated. Improvisation was not failure. It was expected. Music here was something you did, not something you perfected. Jazz did not begin as a rebellion or a movement. It emerged quietly from this environment, the way humidity rises from warm ground. New Orleans did not invent jazz on purpose. It simply created the conditions where it could not help but exist. The soul of jazz was forged long before the first trumpet bent a note. Its earliest heartbeat came from people who had everything taken from them except rhythm. Enslaved Africans brought with them musical traditions that could not be erased. Polyrhythms, call and response, movement tied directly to sound. Even under oppression, music survived because it adapted. It became quieter when it had to. It became communal when solitude was dangerous. Most of all, it became emotional truth in sonic form. In New Orleans, sorrow did not stay silent. Work songs rose from docks and fields, keeping time for labour while giving voice to exhaustion and endurance. Spirituals carried grief upward, blending African musical memory with Christian imagery. These were not songs meant to impress. They were songs meant to hold people together. Rhythm became structure. Repetition became reassurance. Unlike much of the United States, New Orleans allowed certain musical practices to persist publicly. Black musicians played openly in parades, funerals, and social gatherings. Music followed people from birth to burial. Funerals themselves became musical journeys. Slow, mournful processions on the way to the grave, then joyful, defiant rhythms on the way back. Death did not end music, it sharpened it. Blues began to take shape here too, not as a formal genre, but as an emotional vocabulary. Bent notes, vocal inflections, and unresolved tension expressed something words could not. pain was not hidden. It was shaped, stretched, and released. This emotional honesty would become one of jazz's defining features. Importantly, these traditions were never static. Musicians listened constantly, to each other, to European harmony drifting in from opera houses, to Caribbean rhythms arriving through the port. They borrowed freely. A hymn could become a dance tune. A march could become something looser, stranger, more alive. Strict time began to soften. Space appeared between beats. Music started to breathe. Improvisation grew naturally from this environment. When life itself was unstable, rigid repetition made little sense. Musicians learned to respond in the moment, to a crowd, to another player, to emotion itself. This was not chaos, it was conversation. By the end of the 19th century, something new was forming. It did not yet have a name, but it had a feel, rhythm that swung, melodies that bent, and an emotional range that could hold grief and joy at the same time. Jazz was not born from happiness. It was born from survival, learning how to move. As the 19th century drew to a close, the sound forming in New Orleans began to develop recognizable voices. These were not composers in the traditional sense, nor virtuosos chasing perfection. They were working musicians, barbers, laborers, dock workers, men who played because music was woven into daily life. Among them emerged figures spoken of with reverence, even when no recordings survived. One of the most mythic was Buddy Bolden, a cornet player whose influence loomed larger than his documented legacy. Bolden was not famous for technical precision. He was famous for volume, emotion, and freedom. He played loud enough to be heard across neighborhoods, bending notes, stretching rhythm, and injecting raw feeling into structured marches. Listeners said his sound carried something dangerous, unpredictable, alive. He played what people felt but could not say. Around players like Bolden, a new approach emerged. Musicians stopped treating melodies as fixed objects. A tune became a framework, something to push against. One instrument would state a theme, another would respond, a third would comment. This collective improvisation was not rehearsed chaos. It was instinctive collaboration. Everyone listened. Everyone reacted. Much of this music flowed through Storyville, the city's legalized red light district. Storyville was morally condemned and culturally indispensable. Bars, brothels, and dance halls needed music constantly, and they paid for it. Musicians played nightly, learning how to hold attention, build energy, and adapt instantly to shifting moods. If a room wanted heat, they delivered heat. If it wanted melancholy, they slowed the air itself. Crucially, racial boundaries shaped the sound in complex ways. Creole musicians often had formal training and could read music fluently. Black musicians often learned by ear, emphasizing rhythm and feel. When segregation laws forced these groups into closer proximity, their approaches collided. Technique met intuition. Structure met swing. The result was not compromise, but expansion. The instruments themselves began to matter differently. Cornets led melodies. Clarinets twisted around them. Trombones growled from below. Rhythm sections loosened time, letting music sway instead of march. This was no longer European music played differently. It was something new. By the early 1900s, the sound had crossed a threshold. It was still unnamed, still evolving, but it was unmistakable. Jazz was no longer an idea forming in the background. It had stepped forward and found its first voices. If early jazz was a conversation, then Louis Armstrong changed its grammar. Born into deep poverty in New Orleans, Armstrong's childhood was marked by instability, violence, and hunger. Music was not an aspiration at first. It was an accident of survival. After a troubled incident as a boy, he was sent to a reform home where he first learned to play the cornet. What began as discipline quickly became destiny. Armstrong absorbed the city's sound the way others absorb language. He listened constantly, to brass bands, to street parades, to older players who taught not with lectures, but with example. Yet even early on, there was something different in his playing. Where others blended into collective improvisation, Armstrong's horn spoke. His tone was bold, clear, and emotionally direct. You could recognize it instantly, even in a crowd. Jazz before Armstrong emphasized group expression. Everyone played at once, weaving lines together. Armstrong did not destroy this tradition, but he reshaped it. He brought the individual forward. His solos were not decorative breaks. They were statements, stories told with confidence, humour, and authority. When Armstrong played, time seemed to reorganize around him. Equally revolutionary was his sense of rhythm. Armstrong did not simply follow the beat. He leaned against it, stretched it, danced with it. This created what later musicians would call swing, a feeling impossible to notate but instantly recognizable. Jazz stopped marching. It started breathing. His influence spread quickly. Other musicians adjusted their playing in response, giving solos more space, more narrative weight. Bands reorganized themselves around featured players. Jazz began shifting from collective texture to individual voice, without losing its communal roots. Armstrong also transformed jazz vocals. His gravelly voice, playful phrasing, and spontaneous scat singing treated the human voice like another instrument. Singing no longer meant precision or polish. It meant expression. Feeling mattered more than perfection. What Armstrong represented was possibility. He showed that jazz could carry personality without losing soul, structure without stiffness. Through him, jazz stepped onto a larger stage, not by abandoning its origins, but by amplifying them. New Orleans had given jazz its bones. Armstrong gave it a spine, and a face the world would remember. As jazz matured, New Orleans could no longer contain it. Economic pressure, racial violence, and the tightening grip of segregation pushed thousands of black families northward in what became known as the Great Migration. Musicians moved with them, carrying their sound like a passport. Jazz did not leave New Orleans behind. It took the city with it, compressed into memory, rhythm, and style. Chicago became one of the first major destinations. There, jazz found louder rooms, bigger audiences, and longer nights. The music changed in response. Collective improvisation gave way to sharper solos. Bands tightened their arrangements. The pace quickened. Urban life demanded urgency, and jazz obliged. What had once floated through open streets now bounced off brick walls and smoke-filled clubs. New York followed, especially Harlem, where jazz met ambition on an industrial scale. The music entered ballrooms, theatres, and recording studios. It learned how to project. It learned how to sell without surrendering its core. Musicians competed, collaborated, and experimented relentlessly. Jazz became both art and profession, shaped by the realities of rent, reputation, and racial barriers. Recording technology played a critical role. For the first time, jazz could travel without musicians. Records froze improvisation into repeatable moments, spreading styles rapidly, but also locking certain versions into history. This created tension. Jazz thrived on spontaneity, yet fame now depended on consistency. Musicians navigated this contradiction constantly. Despite these changes, the New Orleans spirit endured. Even as arrangements grew more complex, the music retained its emotional directness. Swing still mattered. Groove still ruled. Jazz did not become polite, it became sharper. Importantly, leaving New Orleans did not erase its influence. It magnified it. Musicians referenced home constantly, whether through repertoire, rhythm, or attitude. The city became a mythic origin point, a place of authenticity against which all new developments were measured. Jazz's expansion proved something essential. It was not a local curiosity. It was a living language, capable of adapting without losing meaning. Wherever it landed, it absorbed new influences and reshaped them, just as it had done at birth. New Orleans had released jazz into the world. The world did not dilute it, it tested it, and jazz survived by changing, without forgetting where it learned how to breathe. As jazz settled into northern cities, it entered a new phase, one defined by confidence, scale, and self-awareness. No longer a regional sound fighting for legitimacy, jazz began to see itself as a cultural force. This transformation was most visible in Harlem, where music became inseparable from identity, pride, and modern black expression. Dance halls and ballrooms expanded the music's reach. Big bands replaced smaller ensembles, not to tame jazz, but to amplify it. Arrangements grew more sophisticated, balancing tight orchestration with moments of freedom. This was not jazz abandoning improvisation. It was jazz learning how to command space. At the center of this evolution stood figures like Duke Ellington. Ellington did not treat jazz as raw material to be refined into something respectable. He treated it as already worthy. His compositions were lush, dramatic, and deeply rooted in black musical tradition. He wrote for specific musicians, shaping music around personality rather than forcing players into uniform roles. Jazz, in his hands, became orchestral without losing intimacy. Ellington's work proved something crucial. Jazz could be complex without becoming cold. It could be elegant without losing grit. It could sit on grand stages and still speak directly to lived experience. This redefinition shifted how audiences listened. Jazz was no longer just something you danced to. It was something you heard. At the same time, vocalists began reshaping jazz's emotional range. Singers used phrasing as improvisation, bending time and melody to tell personal stories. Lyrics became less ornamental and more confessional. Jazz allowed vulnerability without apology, yet success brought tension. As jazz gained popularity, commercial pressures increased. Clubs demanded consistency, radio favored familiarity. Musicians faced the challenge of staying inventive in systems that rewarded repetition. Some adapted, others resisted. The push and pull between innovation and acceptance became a defining struggle. Still, the core spirit held. Jazz remained music of presence, created in the moment, shaped by who was in the room and what they felt. It continued to reward listening, risk, and response. This chapter marked jazz's coronation. It was no longer emerging. It had arrived, complex, confident, and self-aware. What lay ahead would test its boundaries even further, but its voice was now unmistakable, strong enough to argue with itself and survive the argument. Once jazz had a crown, it immediately began questioning whether it deserved one. The very success that lifted the music into ballrooms and radio waves also threatened to trap it there. By the late 1930s and early 40s, a new generation of musicians felt boxed in by predictability. Swing was popular, swing was profitable, and swing, to them, was becoming safe. So jazz did what it had always done when confined. It broke its own rules. Late at night, after formal gigs ended, musicians gathered in small clubs and back rooms to experiment. Tempos accelerated, harmonies twisted, melodies fractured and reassembled. This was not music meant for dancing or easy listening. It demanded attention. It demanded effort. Jazz was reclaiming its edge. Figures like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie pushed the music into what became known as bebop. Improvisation turned fierce and intellectual. Solos were no longer just expressive. They were confrontational. Musicians spoke through speed, complexity, and harmonic daring. Jazz stopped explaining itself. This shift was not elitism. It was self-defense. Bebop musicians rejected the idea that jazz existed to entertain on command. They wanted autonomy. They wanted to play for each other, not for applause alone. The music returned to its roots as conversation. But now the conversation was fast, dense, and unapologetically challenging. At the same time, jazz continued to express emotional truth in quieter ways. Vocalists like Billie Holiday stripped songs down to their emotional core. Her phrasing carried pain, resilience, and lived experience with devastating clarity. Jazz proved it could be cerebral and vulnerable at once. These parallel paths, explosive experimentation and intimate expression, expanded jazz's range rather than splitting it. The music refused to be one thing. It refused containment. Critics argued. Audiences divided. Some declared jazz was dying. In reality, it was shedding skin. Jazz had never promised comfort. It promised honesty, even when honesty was difficult to hear. By breaking its own structure, jazz ensured survival. It remained a living language, capable of argument, reinvention, and contradiction. The rules had never been the point. Expression was, and as long as musicians were willing to risk misunderstanding in pursuit of truth, jazz would continue to breathe. By the middle of the 20th century, jazz no longer moved in a single direction. It fractured, multiplied, and explored. Some feared this meant dilution. In truth, it meant freedom. Jazz had grown large enough to contain contradictions without collapsing under them. One of the central figures of this era was Miles Davis, a musician defined less by one sound than by constant reinvention. Davis understood something essential. Jazz did not survive by repeating itself. It survived by risk. Across decades, he stripped music down, slowed it, electrified it, and rebuilt it again. Each phase confused audiences. Each phase opened new doors. Alongside him, John Coltrane pushed jazz inward. His playing searched relentlessly for meaning, stretching improvisation into spiritual inquiry. Notes piled into torrents, then dissolved into silence. Coltrane treated music as a form of devotion, not to religion alone, but to truth itself. Jazz became a vehicle for transcendence. Other musicians explored space, texture, and freedom. Some rejected fixed harmony entirely. Others fused jazz with funk, rock, and global traditions. Purists complained. Innovators listened forward. Jazz had always absorbed its surroundings. Now the surroundings were global. What united these divergent paths was not style, but method. Jazz still relied on listening, response, and presence. Musicians met in the moment, negotiated sound in real time, and accepted uncertainty as part of creation. Even the most experimental forms remained rooted in conversation. Importantly, jazz also became a language of resistance. In a world shaped by segregation, political unrest, and cultural upheaval, improvisation itself carried meaning. To play freely was to assert humanity. To bend structure was to question authority. Jazz did not shout slogans. It embodied defiance through form. By this stage, jazz could no longer be pinned to a place. It belonged to New Orleans, Chicago, Harlem, and everywhere else musicians dared to make it their own. Its origins remained audible, but its future was open. Jazz had become less about sound and more about approach. A way of thinking, a way of responding to pressure with creativity instead of collapse. The road ahead would not be simple or unified, but unity was never jazz's promise. Its promise was motion, restless, searching, alive. Jazz began in a specific place, among specific people, under specific pressures, but it never belonged to one era alone. What ensured its survival was not nostalgia, funding, or institutional approval. It was the fact that jazz answered a permanent human need, the need to express what cannot be neatly said. By the late 20th century, jazz was declared dead more times than it could count. It was no longer dominant on radio. It no longer defined popular dance culture. Younger audiences moved on to louder, simpler forms. Yet jazz did not vanish. It went underground, into small clubs, classrooms, and private rooms, where musicians still gathered for the same reason they always had, to listen and respond. What endured was the method. Jazz remained a discipline of attention. Players showed up without knowing exactly what would happen. They trusted each other enough to risk failure in public. They accepted that beauty might arrive crooked, late, or incomplete. This was not nostalgia for an old sound. It was loyalty to a way of working. Around the world, musicians took jazz and reshaped it through their own histories. In Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America, local rhythms and traditions blended naturally with improvisation. Jazz proved adaptable without erasing its identity. It did not demand imitation. It invited dialogue. Education preserved technique, but living jazz resisted confinement. The music never truly belonged to institutions. It belonged to late nights, imperfect rooms, and players willing to stay present. Wherever that attitude existed, jazz continued, even if it no longer sounded like New Orleans, Harlem, or Chicago. Most importantly, jazz never forgot where it came from. At its core remained the transformation of pressure into expression, sorrow into rhythm, constraint into movement. That lineage connected modern players back to Congo Square, to funerals that danced, to horns answering grief with sound. Jazz did not promise ease. It promised honesty. It asked musicians and listeners alike to stay awake, to feel complexity without simplifying it away. That demand kept it alive. The birth of jazz was not a moment. It was a pattern, one that continues whenever someone listens deeply, responds truthfully, and refuses silence. The city gave it breath. History tested it. Jazz endured, not as a relic, but as a living way of being human. In the early 1790s, the United States existed in an uneasy space between revolution and reality. Independence had been won, but stability had not. The Constitution was still new ink on parchment, its promises untested, its authority uncertain. For many Americans, especially those far from the coastal cities, the federal government felt less like a protector and more like a question mark with teeth. Nowhere was this uncertainty sharper than on the western frontier of Pennsylvania. Life there was hard, isolated, and relentlessly physical. Roads were little more than muddy paths. Markets were distant. Cash was rare. Families survived through barter, cooperation, and improvisation. Government officials were seldom seen, but their decisions were felt keenly. When laws arrived from the east, they often seemed written by men who had never chopped wood, hauled grain, or worried about winter stores. For these frontier farmers, the recent memory of British rule was still fresh. Taxes imposed from afar had once sparked revolution. Standing armies had once symbolized tyranny. Central authority, however well-intentioned, carried the echo of oppression. Independence had not erased those fears. It had sharpened them. The federal government, meanwhile, was struggling to prove it could function at all. War debts loomed. Credit was fragile. Foreign powers watched closely, ready to exploit weakness. Leaders in Philadelphia believed that if the new government failed to enforce its own laws, the entire Republican experiment might collapse. Authority, they argued, had to be visible. Obedience had to be learned. This created a dangerous tension. To federal officials, order meant survival. To frontier settlers, order looked suspiciously like control. The same constitution that promised liberty also empowered taxation and enforcement. Whether that power would be used wisely was still an open question. The United States was not yet a settled nation. It was a work in progress, stitched together by compromise, ambition, and fear. The Whiskey Rebellion would become the first real moment when theory collided with lived reality, when the federal government discovered whether it could command obedience, and when ordinary citizens discovered how far that authority would go. The rebellion did not begin with violence. It began with doubt. On the western frontier, whiskey was not a vice. It was infrastructure. In a region where cash was scarce and transportation unreliable, distilled spirits solved problems that government policy barely acknowledged. Grain was bulky, heavy, and perishable. Whiskey was compact, durable, and valuable. Turning corn or rye into liquor was not indulgence, it was efficiency. For frontier farmers, whiskey functioned as money. It paid labourers, it settled debts, it bought supplies. In places where banks were distant and coins rare, a barrel of whiskey could move an entire local economy. It was also safer to transport. Hauling raw grain over rough mountain roads could wipe out a year's profit. Whiskey condensed value into something a horse could carry without ruin. There was also a social dimension. Whiskey was woven into daily life, shared at barn raisings, funerals, and communal gatherings. It was used medicinally, offered as hospitality, and relied upon during long winters. To tax whiskey was not merely to skim excess, it was to reach directly into the rhythms of survival. Eastern lawmakers viewed the matter differently. To them, whiskey was a commodity like any other, taxable, measurable, and convenient. They lived closer to ports, markets, and coin-based trade. Distillers there often operated on a larger scale and could absorb fees more easily. Frontier producers, small and scattered, felt singled out by a system that ignored geography and hardship. The tax structure itself deepened resentment. It required registration, record keeping, and payment in cash, all difficult demands in remote areas. Compliance meant dealing with federal agents, navigating unfamiliar bureaucracy, and accepting oversight from a government that felt distant and unaccountable. What looked like administration from Philadelphia felt like intrusion in the hills. More than money was at stake. Whiskey symbolized independence. Distilling allowed farmers to remain economically self-reliant rather than dependent on distant markets. A tax threatened that autonomy. It suggested that the federal government could reach into any corner of life and extract value on its own terms. This was not abstract ideology, it was practical fear. If whiskey could be taxed today, what would come next tomorrow? Land, labour, survival itself. By the time protests began, anger had already fermented. The issue was not drunkenness or defiance for its own sake. It was the belief that the new republic was drifting toward the same mistakes as the old empire: distant authority, uneven burden, and laws written by people who would never feel their weight. Whiskey mattered because life depended on it. The whiskey tax did not emerge by accident. It was designed, deliberately and strategically, by Alexander Hamilton as part of a larger vision for the young republic. The United States was drowning in Revolutionary War debt, its credit fragile and its future uncertain. Hamilton believed that survival depended on proving one thing above all else: that the federal government could raise revenue and enforce its own laws. To Hamilton, the tax on distilled spirits was practical. Whiskey was widely produced, difficult to hide, and already part of commerce. Taxing it would generate income while signalling authority. More importantly, it would establish precedent. Laws passed by Congress were not suggestions. They were commands. But this logic, clean and orderly on paper, collided violently with frontier reality. The tax favoured large eastern distillers who produced at scale and could pay flat fees. Small western farmers, distilling seasonally and selling locally, paid more per gallon and were hit harder. Equality under the law existed in theory, not in impact. Enforcement made matters worse. Federal tax collectors arrived as symbols of intrusion. They demanded registration, records, and cash payments, things frontier communities struggled to provide. Compliance felt humiliating. Resistance felt justified. At first, opposition was quiet. Farmers petitioned, they complained, they asked for adjustments. When those efforts failed, resistance hardened. Tax collectors were harassed, threatened, and publicly shamed. Some were tarred and feathered, others resigned. Courts were disrupted. Federal authority was mocked openly. To the rebels, this was not lawlessness, it was defense. They believed they were standing up for the spirit of the revolution, resisting unjust taxation imposed without genuine representation. In their minds, Hamilton was building the very centralized power Americans had fought to destroy. To Hamilton, this resistance was existentially dangerous. If the government backed down, it would invite chaos. Other regions would follow. Laws would become optional. The republic would fracture before it fully formed. Thus the whiskey tax became something far larger than a fiscal measure. It became a referendum on federal power itself. Could the government compel obedience from its citizens? Or would it remain a weak association, unable to act beyond paper? Hamilton was determined to find out. The confrontation he engineered was not reckless. It was calculated, and once resistance crossed from protest into defiance, there would be no retreat, only escalation. The nation was about to discover whether authority could travel west of the mountains. By 1793, resistance in western Pennsylvania had moved beyond complaint and into confrontation. What began as petitions and refusals to register stills hardened into organised opposition. Meetings were held in taverns and fields, committees formed, language sharpened. The idea that the whiskey tax was illegitimate spread faster than federal notices ever could. Tax collectors became the most visible symbols of the law, and therefore its targets. Some were chased from their posts, others were assaulted, stripped, or publicly humiliated. Federal court summons were ignored. When officials tried to serve warrants, crowds gathered to block them. Law was no longer being debated, it was being challenged. The most dramatic moment came in the summer of 1794, when Federal Marshal David Lennox attempted to serve writs on tax resistors. He was met with armed men, gunfire, and open threats. Soon after, the home of Tax Inspector John Neville was attacked and burned. Shots were exchanged, a man was killed. The rebellion crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Rumours raced ahead of facts. Some rebels spoke openly of independence from federal authority. Liberty poles were raised, echoing the symbols of the Revolutionary era. Whiskey rebels framed their cause as the continuation of resistance against tyranny. To them, the government had betrayed the frontier in favour of Eastern elites and financial interests. Meanwhile, leaders in Philadelphia watched with growing alarm. This was no longer a question of tax collection. It was a test of sovereignty. If armed resistance could successfully nullify federal law, then the Constitution itself was little more than an agreement that lasted only until inconvenience arose. The situation placed President George Washington in an impossible position. He was revered as the hero of the Revolution, a symbol of restraint and Republican virtue. But he was also the chief executive of a new government that had never enforced its authority by force. Whatever he chose would define the limits of federal power. Negotiation was attempted. Commissioners were sent west. Amnesty was offered to those willing to comply. Some accepted. Many did not. Defiance remained loud, organised, and visible. The rebellion now posed a clear question. Could the United States survive if laws applied only where convenient? Or would enforcement, however unpopular, prove that the government was real? The answer would not come from speeches or letters. It would come from boots on the ground. The decision that followed was unprecedented. For the first time in American history, the federal government would enforce its authority with armed force against its own citizens. The man who would oversee that response was the same figure who had once led a rebellion against imperial power, George Washington himself. Washington did not act quickly or lightly. He understood exactly what was at stake. Sending troops against farmers risked validating the very fears that fueled the rebellion, that the new government was merely a softer version of the old empire. But allowing armed defiance to stand posed an even greater danger. If federal law could be ignored through violence, the Republic would unravel before it had time to solidify. After exhausting negotiations and issuing repeated warnings, Washington invoked his constitutional authority to call up state militias. Thousands of troops were assembled from multiple states, forming a force larger than any Washington had personally commanded since the Revolution. The message was unmistakable. The government would not bargain with insurrection. Washington made another extraordinary choice. He would not remain in the capital. He rode west to oversee the operation himself, the only sitting United States president ever to lead troops in the field. This was not symbolic theatre. It was a statement of legitimacy. The rebellion was not being crushed by distant bureaucrats. It was being confronted by the embodiment of the Republic. As the militia marched toward western Pennsylvania, resistance melted. The sheer scale of the force stunned the rebels. Many fled. Others swore oaths of loyalty. The feared showdown never fully materialized. There were no major battles, no heroic last stands. Federal authority arrived not with chaos, but with overwhelming inevitability. Arrests were made, though relatively few. 2 men were convicted of treason, and even they were later pardoned. Washington wanted enforcement, not bloodshed. The point had been made. The law would be obeyed, but the government would not indulge revenge. This moment changed the meaning of power in the United States. The federal government had proven it could act decisively without descending into tyranny. Authority, it turned out, did not require cruelty, but it did require resolve. The rebellion ended not with dramatic violence, but with quiet submission. And in that quiet lay a new precedent. Laws passed by Congress would be enforced, even when unpopular, even when resisted. The Republic had taken its first step from fragile experiment toward functioning state. When the militias withdrew and the countryside fell quiet, the Whiskey Rebellion ended without a triumphant finale. There were no victory parades, no public celebrations of restored order. What remained instead was an uneasy calm, and a nation trying to understand what had just happened. On paper, the federal government had won decisively. The tax stood. Armed resistance collapsed. The Constitution had been enforced, not ignored. For leaders in Philadelphia, this outcome validated years of anxiety. The Republic had passed its first real stress test. It could make laws, and it could compel obedience when those laws were challenged. But on the frontier, the mood was different. Many farmers complied not because they were persuaded, but because resistance now seemed futile. The presence of overwhelming force had settled the question of power, not the question of fairness. Resentment did not disappear, it retreated. This ambiguity haunted the victory. The rebellion had proven the strength of federal authority, but it also exposed how fragile public trust remained. A government could enforce obedience, but legitimacy required something more. A sense that laws reflected lived realities, not just financial logic. Politically, the episode sharpened divisions already forming within the young nation. Supporters of strong central government viewed the outcome as necessary and stabilizing. Critics saw it as a warning sign, evidence that concentrated power could turn inward against ordinary citizens. The rebellion became a symbol wielded by both sides, each claiming it proved their point. President Washington understood this tension deeply. His decision to pardon the convicted rebels reflected caution, not weakness. He wanted to close the episode, not turn it into a martyrdom narrative. Force had made the point. Mercy would help the nation move on. The whiskey tax itself remained unpopular and difficult to enforce. Compliance improved, but enthusiasm never did. Eventually, political winds shifted. The tax would be repealed under a new administration, not because the rebellion succeeded, but because resistance had revealed its impracticality. That outcome matters. The Whiskey Rebellion was not a story of government crushing dissent and moving on unchanged. It was a dialogue conducted through tension, force, and retreat. Authority was asserted, then adjusted. The episode left behind a lesson that would echo through American history. Federal power could be real without being absolute. Enforcement did not end debate. It reframed it. The rebellion failed in its immediate aim. But it succeeded in something quieter. It forced the young republic to confront the distance between policy and people. Long after the last militia units returned home, the true impact of the Whiskey Rebellion continued to unfold. What mattered most was not the tax itself, nor the handful of arrests, but the precedent now embedded in American political life. The federal government had demonstrated, unmistakably, that it possessed both the legal authority and the practical capacity to enforce its laws within the states. This was new. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had been weak, dependent on voluntary compliance. The rebellion proved that the Constitution had changed that balance. The United States was no longer a loose agreement among states. It was a sovereign entity with teeth. Future leaders would remember this moment. Whenever resistance arose, whether over tariffs, civil rights, or labor, the Whiskey Rebellion stood as the first example of how federal authority could be asserted without collapsing into dictatorship. It became a reference point, quietly shaping decisions for generations. Yet the precedent cut both ways. If the government could enforce unpopular laws through force, it also carried the responsibility to use that power carefully. The rebellion underscored a truth that would haunt American politics. Legitimacy is not automatic. It must be maintained, not merely imposed. The event also accelerated the formation of political factions. Disagreements over the rebellion sharpened ideological lines between those who favoured a strong central government and those who feared it. These divisions would soon crystallize into the first political parties, transforming disagreement into organised opposition rather than armed resistance. In this sense, the Whiskey Rebellion helped redirect conflict from violence into politics. Dissent did not disappear, it evolved. Protest moved from fields and taverns into newspapers, elections, and legislative battles. That shift may have been the rebellion's most enduring contribution. Ironically, the farmers who lost the confrontation influenced the future more than they knew. Their resistance exposed the limits of policy detached from local realities. Their anger revealed the dangers of governing from abstraction alone. Federal power survived, but it learned it could not operate in isolation from the people it ruled. The rebellion proved that the United States would not fracture at the first sign of internal conflict, but it also proved that unity would always require negotiation, compromise, and restraint, not just authority. The Republic had asserted itself. Now it had to live with the consequences of that assertion. In the years after the rebellion, the immediate threat faded, but its imprint lingered in policy and politics. The whiskey tax remained on the books, yet enforcement never fully recovered its footing. Collection was uneven, compliance was reluctant. The lesson was clear to anyone paying attention. Authority could compel obedience, but it could not manufacture consent. A shift arrived with a change in leadership. When Thomas Jefferson entered the presidency, he inherited both the power proven by Washington and the resentment that power had stirred. Jefferson opposed the whiskey tax on principle and practicality. He viewed it as unnecessary, regressive and corrosive to trust. In 1802, the tax was repealed, not as a concession to rebellion, but as a recalibration of governance. This repeal did not undo the precedent of enforcement. It refined it. The government had shown it could act decisively. Now it showed it could listen and adjust. That combination, resolve followed by restraint, became a model for navigating internal conflict without returning to violence. Public memory of the rebellion evolved. To some, it was a warning against overreach. To others, proof that the Constitution worked. In textbooks and speeches, it became a hinge moment, the first time the federal state tested itself against armed resistance and emerged intact. The drama lay not in bloodshed, but in restraint after strength. For frontier communities, life went on much as before. Distilling continued. Barter persisted. The sense of distance from the capital never vanished, but it softened. The state felt real now, not just an idea, but a presence that could arrive and then withdraw. Politically, the episode redirected dissent. Americans learned that protest had leverage when it moved through elections and institutions rather than rifles. Newspapers replaced liberty poles. Campaigns replaced committees of resistance. The rebellion did not end conflict. It taught the nation where conflict would be fought next. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. The United States had faced itself and chosen cohesion over fragmentation. It had tested the line between liberty and law and discovered that neither survived alone. Power needed limits. Dissent needed channels. The Whiskey Rebellion ended quietly, but it left behind a durable grammar for American governance. How to assert authority, when to ease it, and why legitimacy matters more than victory. The Whiskey Rebellion is often remembered for its spectacle. Farmers in revolt, militias on the march, a president riding west. But its true significance lies deeper in what it revealed about the nature of the American experiment at its most vulnerable stage. This was not simply a tax dispute. It was the first moment when the United States had to decide what kind of nation it intended to be. The rebellion forced a confrontation between two powerful ideas born from the revolution itself. One was liberty. the belief that government exists only with the consent of the governed and must remain close to the people. The other was authority, the belief that laws, once made through constitutional process, must apply to everyone, or they mean nothing. The Whiskey Rebellion was the collision point where neither idea could fully retreat. What made this moment extraordinary was how narrowly it avoided catastrophe. The federal government proved it could enforce the law without descending into terror. The rebels proved that dissent could be loud and disruptive without tearing the nation apart. No foreign army invaded, no state seceded. The republic bent, but it did not break. For President George Washington, the episode cemented a lasting principle. Civilian government, not generals or mobs, would rule. His restraint after victory mattered as much as his resolve before it. Power was demonstrated, and then deliberately lowered. For ordinary Americans, the rebellion clarified something uncomfortable. Independence had not abolished government power. It had merely relocated it. The question was no longer whether authority existed, but how it would be used, challenged, and corrected. That realization marked a step into political adulthood. The Whiskey Rebellion did not produce heroes in the traditional sense. It produced precedents. It showed that internal conflict could be survived without revolution. That disagreement could harden into resistance, then dissolve back into politics. That the Constitution was not self-enforcing, but neither was it hollow. In later centuries, Americans would argue fiercely over federal power, taxation, and resistance. Each time, the shadow of the Whiskey Rebellion lingered, a reminder that the nation had faced this tension before, early and raw, and had chosen continuity over collapse. The rebellion failed as an uprising, but it succeeded as a test. And in passing that test, the United States proved, for the first time, that it was more than a revolution that had already ended.